Abigail, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time. Just help us understand first. Let's just begin there. There's so much that's been happening in the last couple of weeks in terms of what the government is doing in preparing for a post-national state of disaster environment in the country. There's a flurry of directions, codes and regulations, and then the minister speaks yesterday. What should we really make out of all of this? Just give us some clarity.
Well, thank you for having me, Dan. And, I'd agree. I think there's a lot of confusion at this stage after Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma's address. But I think the takeaway is three pieces of regulations or codes, if you will, and to just try and understand how they all fit into the picture. So the first is, as you've said, the draft post-national state of emergency regulations. So these were published yesterday for comment and on an extremely short timeline. So ordinarily you'll see a bill published for comment for 30 days or something according to that number. But this has only been published for comment until the 1st of April. And if you take a look at the regulations, it accounts for transitional arrangements. So it says we're cognizant of the fact that the national state of disaster is going to come to an end. And these regulations simply say there are certain provisions in the regulations to the Disaster Management Act which will find application during our transitional period. So when the national state of disaster is declared closed or over, these transitional regulations come into place. And there's a provision in the regulations which say they will come into place for 30 days after the national state of disaster is declared over. And in particular, the regulations that will apply for those 30 days are 67, 69, and 75. So 69 relates to mask wearing, and 75 relates to the partial opening of borders, and 69 relates to gatherings. But I think the difficulty arises when we take a look at the two pieces of legislation or regulations, if you will, that were published on the 15th of March 2022. So the first is a code that was promulgated in terms of the Labour Relations Act, which makes reference to the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Now, this code specifically says that it will only come into play when the national state of disaster ends, and it will replace the directions that were previously published on the 11th of June 2021. And there are substantial differences between that directive in June 2021 and this code, not least in relation to mask wearing, in relation to objections to mandatory vaccination, for example. So there's the code. And then there's also a draft bill that was promulgated also on the 15th of March in relation to the National Health Act. Now, this bill proposes three significant changes. The first is that under the regulations promulgated in December 2017 in terms of the National Health Act, there's something called a notifiable medical condition. And conditions which fall into this category are cholera, for example, smallpox, yellow fever. So in early 2020, the Department of Health declared COVID-19 as a notifiable medical condition. And what this draft amendment has said is it says that if you are in contact with someone who has a notifiable medical condition, have a laboratory confirmed case, or you are suspected of having a laboratory confirmed case of COVID-19, you are not permitted to say no to a mandatory quarantine, but also what's quite interesting is mandatory prophylaxis. So what this refers to is precautionary treatment, and vaccines fall under mandatory prophylaxis. So what we see in this draft regulation is really room for provisions in relation to mandatory vaccination, in the sense that you can be compelled by way of a competent court order to subject yourself to mandatory prophylaxis.
Sorry, thank you. I mean, you've sort of tried and piece all of these things together, still wondering what is going to be the outcome here. In your view, Abigail, in the last minute we have with you now, what should be next? What should we be expecting next? Yes, there's this 48-hour thing now for the draft regulations that were published yesterday, but just generally going forward, what should be next?
So in the 48 hours of public comment, those public comments will be received, and it's said that President Ramaphosa will consider those public comments and then make a decision in relation to the conclusion of the national state of disaster in relation to that. So the next first step is really the declaration of the end of the national state of disaster. And we then move into this era of legislation post the national state of disaster, which is fairly confusing at this stage, and has multiple provisions which contradict each other. And so I think we're going to need to move into an era of further clarity after the end of the national state of disaster, particularly in relation to what's being said for employers and also what's being said in relation to the National Health Act.
And the notifiable disease stuff. Thank you very much for your time. We don't have much time. I would like to have had more time. That's Abigail Butcher. She's, of course, Associate in Employment Law Practice at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr.